That Lass of LOWRIE'S by Hodgson Burnett. Chapter 13. Notwithstanding Annis's interference in his behalf, Paul did not find his labours become very much lighter. It seemed that one task disposed of, another presented itself. Often he found that he had barely breathing time left between one difficulty and another, and then, after all his labour, the prospect before him was not promising. Instead of appearing easier to cope with, as he learned more of it and its inhabitants, Wigan seemed still more baffling. His district lay in the lower end of the town, among ugly back streets and alleys, among dirt and ignorance and obstinacy. He spent his days in labouring amongst people upon whom he sometimes fancied he had obtained no hold. It really seemed that they did not want him, these people, and occasionally a more distressing view of the case presented itself to his troubled mind, namely, that to those who might chance to want him, he had little to offer. He had his temporal thorn too. He found it difficult to read, hard to fix his mind on his modest sermons. Occasionally, he even accused himself of forgetting his duty. All this grew out of the night when he stood at the door and listened to his friend's warning concerning the rector's daughter. Derrick's words were simple enough in themselves, but they had fallen upon the young curate's ears with startling significance. He had given this significance to them himself, in spite of himself, and then all at once he had fallen to wondering why it was that he had never thought of such a possible denouement before. It was so very possible, so very probable. Nay, when he came to think of it seriously, it was only impossible that it should not be. He had often told himself that some day a lover would come who would be worthy of the woman he had not even hoped to win, and who was more worthy than Fergus Derrick, who was more like the hero to whom such women surrendered their hearts and lives. If he himself had been such a man, he thought, with the simplicity of affection, he would not have felt that there was need for fear, and the two had been thrown so much together, and would be thrown together so frequently again. He remembered how Fergus had been adopted into the family circle, and calling to mind 100 trifling incidents, smiled at his own blindness. When, the next day, he received Annis's message, he received it as an almost positive confirmation. It was not like her to bestow favours from an idle impulse. It was not so easy now to meet the girl in his visits to the rectory. It was not easy to listen to Mr. Barhome while Annis and Fergus Derrick sat apart and talked. Sometimes he wondered if the time could ever come when his friend would be less his friend because he had rivalled him. The idea of such a possibility only brought him fresh pain. He could not bear to confront it. His gentle, chivalric nature shrank within itself at the thought of the bereavement that double loss would be. There was little room in his mind for the envies of stronger men. Certainly Fergus had no suspicion of the existence of his secret pain. He found no alteration in him. Among the Reverend Paul's private ventures was a small night school, which he had managed to establish by slow degrees. He had picked up a reluctant scholar here and one there, 2 or 3 pit lads, 2 or 3 girls, and 2 or 3 men, for whose awkward patronage he had worked so hard and waited so long that he was quite surprised at his success in the end. He scarcely knew how he had managed it, but the pupils were there in the dingy room of the National School, waiting for him on 2 nights in the week, upon which nights he gave them instruction on a plan of his own. He had thought the matter so little likely to succeed at first that he had engaged in it as a private work, and did not even mention it until his friends discovered it by chance. Said Jub Bates to Miss Barhome during one of their confidential interviews, "Did they ever go to a neat school?" "No," said Annis. Judd fondled Nib's ears patronisingly. "I have, and I'm going again. So is Nib. He's getting one." Who? For Judd had signified by a gesture that he was not the dog, but some indefinite person in the village. The little parson. Say Mr. Grace, suggested Anise. It sounds better. Aye, Mr. Grace, but everybody calls him little parson. He's getting a neat school in town, and he asked me to go, and I went. I took Nib, and we learned our letters. Leastways I learned mine, and Nib, he listened with his ears up, and the Mr. Grace laughed. He weren't a vexed at Nib coming. He said, let him come, as he was so old-fashioned. So Mr. Grace found himself informed upon, and was rather abashed at being confronted with his enterprise a few days after by Miss Barham. I like it, said Anise. Joan Lowrie learned to read and write in a night school. Mr. Derrick told me so. A new idea seemed to have been suggested to her. Mr. Grace, she said, why could not I help you, might I? His delight revealed itself in his face. His first thought was a selfish young clerical one, and sudden consciousness sent the colour to his forehead as he answered her, though he spoke quite calmly. There is no reason why you should not, if you choose, he said, unless Mr. Barham should object. I need not tell you how grateful I should be. Papa will not object, she said quietly. The next time the pupils met, she presented herself in the schoolroom. 10 minutes after Grace had given her work to her, she was as much at home with it as if she had been there from the first. Who's a little un, said one of the boys, but who does not seem to be easy fear, who does not look a bit took back. She had never been so near to Paul Grace during their friendship as when she walked home with him. A stronger respect for him was growing in her, a new reverence for his faithfulness. She had always liked and trusted him, but of late she had learned to do more. She recognised more fully the purity and singleness of his life. She accused herself of having underrated him. Please let me help you when I can, Mr. Grace, she said. There may be times when I can use my influence. Promise that you will ask me to use it when it is possible. I am not blaming anybody. There is no real blame, even if I had the right to attach it to anyone. But there are mistakes now and then, and you must promise me that I may use my influence to prevent them. She had stopped at the gate to say this, and she held out her hand. It was a strange thing that she could be so utterly oblivious of the pain she inflicted, but even Derrick would have taken her hand with less self-control. He was so fearful of wounding or disturbing her that he was continually on his guard in her presence, and especially when she was thus warm and unguarded herself. He had fancied before sometimes that she had seen his difficulties and sympathised with him in them, but he had never hoped that she would be thus unreserved. His thanks came from the depths of his heart. He felt that she had lightened his burden. After this, Miss Barham was rarely absent from her place at the school. The 2 evenings always found her at work among her young women, and she made very steady progress among them. By degrees the enterprise was patronised more freely. New pupils dropped in, and were usually so well satisfied that they did not drop out again. Grace gave all the credit to Anise, but Anise knew better than to accept it. She had been his novelty, she said. Time only would prove whether her usefulness was equal to her power of attraction. She had been teaching in the school about 3 weeks, when a servant came to her one night as she sat reading, with the information that a young woman wished to see her. A fine-looking young woman, miss, added the girl. I put her into your own room as you give orders. The room was a quiet place away from the sounds of the house, which had gradually come to be regarded as Miss Barham's. It was not a large room, but it was a pretty one, with wide windows and a good view, and, as her niece liked it, her possessions drifted into it until they filled it. Her books, her pictures, her little luxuries, and as she spent a good deal of her time there, it was invariably spoken of as her room, and she had given orders to the servants that her village visitors should be taken to it when they came. Carrying her book in her hand, she went upstairs. She had been very much interested in what she was reading, and had hardly time to change the channel of her thought, but when she opened the door, she was brought back to earth at once. Against the end wall was suspended a picture of Christ in the last agony, and beneath it was written, "It is finished." Before it, as her niece opened the door, stood Joan Lowrie, with Lizzie's sleeping child on her bosom. She had come upon the picture suddenly, and it had seized on some deep, reluctant emotion. She had heard some vague history of the man, but it was different to find herself in this silent room, confronting the upturned face, the crown, the cross, the anguish, and the mystery. She turned towards her niece, forgetting all else but her emotions. She even looked at her for a few seconds in questioning silence, as if waiting for an answer to words she had not spoken. When she found her voice, it was of the picture she spoke, not of the real object of her visit. "Thou knows," she said, "I dunna, though I've heard on it afore. What is it as is finished? I dunna quite see. What is it?" "It means," said her niece, "that God's Son has finished his work." Joan did not speak. "I have no words of my own to explain," continued her niece. "I can tell you better in the words of the men who loved him and saw him die." Joan turned to her then, her ear caught by the last words. "Saw him die?" she repeated. "There were men who saw him when he died, you know," said her niece. "The New Testament tells us how. It is as real as the picture, I think. Did you never read it?" The girl's face took an expression of distrust and sullenness. "The Bible has not been in my line," she answered. "I've left that to parsons and like, but the picture took me eye. It seemed different." "Let us sit down," said her niece. "You'll be tired of standing." When they sat down, her niece began to talk about the child, who was asleep, lowering her voice for fear of disturbing it. Joan regarded the little thing with a look of half-subdued pride. "I brought it because I knowed it'd be easier with me than with Liz," she said. "It worrits Liz, and it now worrits me. I'm so strong, you see. I can carry it and scarce feel its weight, but it wears Liz out, and it seems to me as it knows it too. For the minute she begins to fret, it frets too." There was a certain shamefacedness in her manner when at last she began to explain the object of her errand. Annie's could not help fancying that she was impelled on her course by some motive whose influence she was reluctant to submit to, as if, whatever it might be, it forced her onward against her will. She had come to speak about the night school. "There were a neat school here once afore as I went to," she said. "I like to read there and write a bit, but there's other things I'd like to know. Tha canst understand," she added a little abruptly. "I needna tell you. Little Jud Bates said as you had a class of your own, and it coming into my mind as I would ask you about it. If I go to school, I'd like to be with you." "You can come to me, and do you know, I think you can help me." This thought had occurred to her suddenly. "I am sure you can help me," she repeated. When Joan at last started to go away, she paused before the picture, hesitating for a moment, and she turned to her niece again. "You say as the boot makes it seem real as the picture," she said. "It seems so to me," her niece answered. "Will you lend me the boot?" she asked abruptly. Her niece's own Bible lay upon a side table. She took it up and handed it to the girl, saying simply, "I will give you this one, if you will take it. It was mine." And Joan carried it away with her.